one of the phrases that I think about a lot in this is we like what we eat most often. Our taste buds only live for 2 weeks. So we are constantly updating our palate. Constantly. We're constantly getting a new palate and kind of training it. And the most extreme example of this is that if you've ever like gone on a low sodium diet, like if I have a patient with heart failure, let's say, and they truly need a low sodium diet so they don't have water retention, we everything tastes super bland at first when you first go low sodium because salt is a flavor enhancer. But after about a month, you go back and if you've been on this low salt eating pattern and then all of a sudden you go and you eat like McDonald's French fries, you're like, oh my gosh, I can barely even handle these because they're so salty. So our taste buds actually do adapt to what we are eating, and the more nutritious, nourishing food you eat, the more you are going to crave them.
What's up, you beautiful beasts? I'm Katie. I'm on a mission to help humans become their favorite versions of themselves and to strive for overall health by healing their relationship to food and exercise, healing their relationship to their body, and most importantly, healing their relationship to themselves, all without ever having to step on a scale. I have had the privilege to talk to all kinds of different humans who have been through a plethora of experiences just being a human and existing. I believe that every single time someone shares their story, at least one person listening will learn from it, be inspired by it, and maybe, just maybe, even change the entire direction of their life. These are the stories of humans unveiling their beautiful beast. Keep listening. This is the Unveiling the Beast podcast. I think one of the analogies I love is like, just because I'm gross, is like if you have to pee really bad, you don't just say, "Oh, I'm gonna hold it till later to see if it goes away." And it's the same thing with what we do with food. It's like I'm hungry, but let me just wait a little longer to see if my hunger pain goes away. Well, it either will go away and you're still going to be hungry, or it'll just get worse because you're hungry. So,
Right.
yeah. So yeah, can you tell the listeners a little bit about who you are and why you think you are who you are?
Absolutely. My name is Ann Kent, and I'm a registered dietitian nutritionist. My background is in diabetes education. I worked for over a decade in an endocrinology clinic as a certified diabetes care and education specialist. And then I moved into private practice and I created a meal planning app because I saw this need. Well, maybe the most common request from any patient was just tell me what to eat. And as you and I were just talking, it's really not that simple. Nobody
Yeah.
really wants to be told what to eat. But on the other hand, there was just this overwhelm about nutrition information. They're getting nutrition advice from everywhere. Like you Google diabetes nutrition, and it's like so overwhelming. So that's why I created a meal planning app, was to give people a little bit of a guidance, but like also show them how you can incorporate all different kinds of foods in a balanced way. So you don't have to eat brown rice if you don't want to. You can eat white rice. That's totally fine. And let me show you how to balance that so that you still honor your health and your taste buds. Like, how do we incorporate that? So fast forward a few years, I've been in private practice for about 5 years now. And this year I completed my certification to be an intuitive eating counselor. So I've really tried to incorporate a non-diet approach into the meal planning app. And that's one thing that I really think separates or sets me apart from some of the other meal planning that's out there is I care deeply about your health and I want you to have good energy and good, blood sugar and heart markers and all those things, but getting there from a non-diet or more of an intuitive eating space.
Yeah. I would say also it would be reversed too, where you're different in the intuitive eating space in that you have a meal planning app.
Yes.
Um,
I think you're right. I have
so
seen this like pendulum swing, especially on social media, where I think when you're first getting into intuitive eating and you're in that like first phase of rejecting diet culture, oftentimes uh, there is a natural pendulum swing when you're going through the process of intuitive eating. But I see a lot of people kind of get stuck there and or be kind of turned off by intuitive eating because they also really care about fixing their physical problem because they're physically not feeling well. And sometimes it is related
Yeah.
to like what or when or how they're eating. So yeah, I think that that intersection of loving what you eat for all of the reasons, both like taste and culture, but also because it's what makes you feel best in your body is so important.
Yeah, I've actually had this conversation with the last two guests that were on, and like, how do we get to a place where we say, I eat whatever I want, and
Mm-hmm.
it not mean I eat ultra processed junk food all day, you know? Because like
Totally.
typically if you just walk up to somebody on the street and you said, I eat whatever I want, that's probably what they would think because of the way we are taught and programmed in
Mm-hmm.
society. So,
Yeah, one of the frameworks that I found really helpful in understanding that is to understand kind of the different brain levels that we have. And so this is in the intuitive eating book. I think you're pretty familiar with that. But in the very beginning, they talk about we have our reptilian brain, which is the
mhm.
part of our brain in the brainstem that is just getting our basic needs met. So sleep and food and going to the bathroom, like all of those like really, really basic needs. And then we have our emotional brain, we have our mammalian brain, which starts to bring in our feelings and coping and stress and all of those things. But then as humans, we also have this really cool prefrontal cortex, which allows us to have the executive functioning to take in the information from our reptilian and mammalian brain, but it also allows us to make higher level decisions about things like food. So, for example, I might be I just talked about this the other day in my Instagram stories. I was craving chocolate in the afternoon, and I thought, oh, okay, I'm craving chocolate. I'm hungry. But then I started to bring in some of my executive processing to actually make a decision about what I wanted to eat. So, first of all, I'm going to honor my biological need of hunger. But next, I'm going to choose what to eat. And so I thought about what flavors I was craving. I was craving something sweet. I thought about what other foods I'd eaten earlier in the day, and I had actually had dessert for lunch, and I usually didn't, and so I was kind of like I already had some sugar earlier in the day, and I thought, you know what, I haven't had as many like fruits and vegetables, so I'm going to start with a sweet apple. I'm going to like start with a piece of fruit and see if that meets my meets my need. It'll meet my biological hunger need. It'll meet the sweet craving that I'm having. Let's see if that meets the need. And it turned out that it did. And I wasn't sad. I didn't miss out on chocolate because I also gave myself unconditional permission to eat chocolate, which is the piece of diet culture
Mhm.
that sometimes gets us tripped up when we make a healthy choice, quote unquote healthy. But if we're not truly living in the freedom of being able to eat whatever you want, then the healthy choice can feel restrictive. So anyway, I don't know if
Yeah.
that helps to see that example, but I totally agree with you. Intuitive eating is so much more than just acting on that initial impulse because we have this beautiful executive functioning brain that we can bring in maybe a better decision.
Yeah. What would you say to the person who like just heard everything you just said about your example with craving the chocolate and they're just like, "Oh my gosh, that is so like why would I have to put that much effort into thinking about what I'm eating?" Because I'm asking because this was me.
Mm-hmm. I mean, my first response to that is that you are probably already putting that much effort into thinking about food.
Mm,
It's just often a reactive way of thinking instead of a proactive way of thinking. So that's my first response. And I feel the same way about meal planning. Oftentimes we think of like meal planning or planning ahead as like this big, onerous, time consuming thing. But if you don't do it, you end up spending so much more time thinking about what you're going to eat because you haven't planned in advance. So I would say that that's the same about each of those decisions. But secondly, this, I just explained it in several minutes, but this was like a 30-second decision for me because I've done it so many times. And so this is one
right.
thing about intuitive eating that it takes time and effort and conscious thinking when you are getting used to this. And then the more you do it, the easier it becomes. And eventually it's just second nature. And so that's why someone who has been a lifelong intuitive eater or who is, really comfortable in this, they are able to say, I just eat whatever I want because they're using all of those different wants. They're not just using their reptilian basic needs wants, they're also using their core values of health and, I want to treat my body well. They're using all of those wants to come to that decision.
Yeah, I love that explanation. And also I like to always add too, like learning learning to listen to your body and like reconnecting the mind and the body. It's a long process and people are so used to the let's take a pill, let's go on this crash diet so everything happens fast, fast, fast. And one of the things that I've been saying recently is like, A, the time's going to pass anyway.
Hmm.
And B, do you want to become an expert at your own body or do you want to become an expert at quick fixes?
Hmm.
Yeah. Does that make sense? Like, because if you only ever do the quick fix and then you go back to where you were before, and then you do the quick fix and then you go back to where you were before, and then you do the shortcut and then you go back to where you were before, you're going to get so good at doing the shortcuts rather than taking the time to learn about your own body because we're so disconnected. Our minds and our bodies are so disconnected because of the culture and society that we live in. And lots
Yeah,
of
and
misinformation on social media. So,
mhm. I think sometimes it's a coping mechanism almost too, right? Like for many of us,
mm,
for most of us, eating is way more than about just food itself. It comes with a lot of baggage for a lot of us, whether,
mm,
many people and even myself, we were raised in a certain culture that expected a clean plate at the end of the meal, or, like we were sent messages about food that developed during really important periods of our life. And so they are like really, really deeply seated. And to your point about these quick fixes, none of those are really treating the underlying problem. And this is something that I have a dietitian colleague and we run a an intuitive eating program called an intensive nutrition reset. And the idea is to help you start to flip the script and to understand that there's more to the surface. There's more to your why of why you're eating than just I'm craving chocolate. We need to, in fact, back up and get to like the underlying need that's not being met when you say that. And so when I say I'm craving chocolate, my underlying need was biological hunger. And so I could very easily choose an apple and it satisfied that. But if I was craving chocolate because I had just gotten into a fight with my spouse, my need was probably different. An apple absolutely would have not
mm,
solved my problem, and I probably would have been seeking the dopamine or the comfort that I really needed. And so I think a lot of times with food, you're absolutely right. Like it's hard work, but the reason it's hard is not because of the food; it's because of the origin of whatever sort of, I want to use the word trauma, with caution, because sometimes there is actual trauma that we need to heal. And sometimes there's
yeah,
just, hard situations that we haven't learned how to cope with in a healthier way. So it goes back to like getting into the why. And do you want to be on that cycle of like, I'm just putting band-aids on this problem? I'm just putting band-aids on the problem. If you have a broken arm, no band-aid is ever going to be big enough to fix it. So if you really want
yeah,
to heal, it's probably going to be a little bit painful at first, but man, is the result going to give you so much more freedom.
yeah. I'm glad that you mentioned trauma too, because a lot of the people that I work with have traumas and emotional eating behaviors. And I was speaking to someone the other day about how, like, we use the example of a headache, and you can get a headache, you can take ibuprofen or Tylenol, and it'll fix it. And then the headache will come back, and then you take ibuprofen or Tylenol. And the issue is, like, sure, the Tylenol or the painkillers work, but we're not actually figuring out where the headache comes from. So this could be an example. You have a headache because you're stressed. You're stressed because you're trying to make everybody else happy. You're trying to make everybody else happy because you're a people pleaser and a perfectionist. And so why don't we work on that? Like that piece, which it all fits together. Like I have in my programs I have 7 pillows of health. Like, are you getting enough sleep? Are you getting enough um are you feeding yourself? Are you moving your body? Are you decluttering your spaces? I can't remember all of them off hand, pampering yourself to de-stress? Are you in healthy relationships? And while they are single individual categories, they all relate to each other. And so it goes back to the headache, where the headache could be coming from something like perfectionism because you're stressing yourself out. That was a very long explanation, but there you go.
I agree. No, absolutely. I mean, these are symptoms, right? Like eating is
Mm.
often a symptom, but the problem is that diet culture treats it as the problem to be solved, and they tell you that it's your willpower that's the issue. But really,
Mhm.
I take a really different approach when it comes to food and eating. And if something if you're doing, and actually this is true for anything, if you're doing a behavior that you don't want to be doing, I think it's important to remember that behaviors are our best attempt to get our needs met. And so if you find yourself coming home from work and devouring the entire package of Oreos, that is not about a moral failure. That's not because you lacked willpower. That is your body somewhere in your brain screaming for you to pay attention to an underlying need that's not being met. So you can either sort of do this like top down approach, authoritarian sort of like, well, just don't have the Oreos in your house, or like, I'm going to lock up this food, or I'm going to like try to control this. Or you
Mhm.
can get curious and say, well, I wonder what this is trying to tell me. I wonder what I'm missing. And I use the Maslow's hierarchy of needs pyramid quite a bit. I
Mhm.
don't, where so on the very base of the pyramid are those basic needs, and you can't reach your higher level of self-actualization, or which is where motivation and willpower lie, if your
Mhm.
underlying needs aren't being met. So there's so often, and it goes back to what you were saying earlier about we're taught that we should ignore our hunger cues, which when you start framing this as thinking about that Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it becomes more and more insane to think about ignoring that. Because all of a sudden, if you're underwater and you're not breathing, the response just is not to, well, just try harder. It's to get above water and breathe. And that's what we're telling people to do with food. Well, if you just need to suppress it more, you just need to ignore it. And it's just going to get more urgent until you actually take care of that need.
Yeah. My listeners know I get so fired up when we're talking about hunger pangs and willpower. I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
we won't go there now, but like
Yeah, it's your body
but I
screaming
did
for
want to
help.
rewind. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And we're like, well, you just don't have enough willpower because you ate. No, I'm a human and I fed my body what it was. Anyway, anyway, I want to rewind a little bit. You were talking about oh my gosh, I'm brain farting on the word you used,
The Maslow's.
authoritarian
Oh,
approach. Is that
yeah.
what you said?
Mhm.
With, well, I just won't keep it in the house. I'll hide it. I'll lock it up. Um, I want to speak about that for a minute
Mhm.
because um, in my beginning days of kind of learning and trying to teach my friends about intuitive eating, I would talk about this like it's not keeping it in the house, it's giving yourself full permission to eat it. And then when you do so, you're not going to want it all the time because you're not telling yourself you can't have it. And my friends would say, oh no, I just know me. And I'm like,
Mhm.
okay, I don't get it. So, to a person in that stage, what would you say?
They're feeling that way because they haven't made peace with food yet. And so you're in the pre-intuitive eating space. And it's always going to feel
Mm.
terrifying to have those Oreos or that ice cream or whatever in the house until you truly do the work and make peace with food. So again, it's kind of that to me is a symptom when someone, because I hear that all the time, like this is the tool that I use. And um, I use this framework. It's within intuitive eating, but it's like the binge restriction cycle. And
Mm.
anytime that there is restriction, whether it's coming from a diet, whether it's coming from something as awful as food insecurity, especially food insecurity in childhood, which is a whole other thing, or this idea of like, I'm never going to get it in the future. So if it's here and I'm never going to get it in the future, that is enough of a psychological trigger to sometimes make you overeat because you know it's not going to be available in the future. So I would never ask someone to do something that they're not ready to do. And so that person who comes into my office and is like, there's no way I can keep Oreo cookies in my house. I'm like, you know what? This is like, it's your house, it's your life. Like, it's like you have the freedom to do that. And my question to them is like, is that really serving them? Or is that, are we doing a band-aid approach? And if someone is not ready to change it, then, you know, I respect that. And we'll just talk about, you know, what it would look like if they had that freedom. Do they even want that freedom? Would you even like the freedom to be around all of these sweets and to not feel overwhelmed by them, for you to feel empowered in your choices? And oftentimes, I think we think that we are in control by using these tools, but actually we're giving a lot of power to that food. So once we're able to unpack that, I think, you know, it's easier to have the conversation about, okay, well, now how do I make peace with food?
Yeah. I'm going to use my own story as part of this because I read the book Intuitive Eating in 2019, I want to say, for the first time. So, I mean, c- compared to my lifetime of dieting, it's still relatively new to me, even though it's been 5 years. And so I'm still working on things like that. So any junk food in my house in the past, we would have to eat it all up by Sunday night because Monday's the day, right? Tomorrow's the day. And now I can keep most things in my house, like chips, they'll be in my house for like 2 weeks. Sometimes they'll go stale and we throw them away. Um, and there's still a few things that I haven't quite healed my relationship with yet. And Oreos is one of them, double stuffed Oreos. Like I could still sit and eat 8 of them and get a stomach ache. And I'm going, I should be farther along by now. But the truth is, like for the person listening who's about to start, it's part of the journey. Like yeah, that's all I can say. It's just part of it. Like I'll eventually be able to have Oreos in my house, but I keep buying them because I know eventually I can have them in the house, and I probably somewhere need to do some deeper work on why I eat 8 Oreos and get a stomach ache.
Right, absolutely. And you know, there
You
are a
know?
lot of different exercises around that. Like, is it
Mhm.
is it the flavor of the Oreos that you love? Is it bringing you back to like a time in the past that you felt really safe and really joyful or something? You know, like when do you feel that craving for Oreos? So the more curiosity you can bring to those moments, the more helpful it's going to be. And I think it's really easy to bring judgment instead of curiosity. And so sometimes I, depending on, you know, where you're coming from in that moment, um, sometimes I use the framework of your inner child. So we have like our inner adult and our inner child. And if your inner child, oftentimes it's the inner child whose needs are not being met, who is craving the entire sleeve of Oreos. Because I have a almost 3-year old, and if I were to leave him, I mean, like he is making decisions with mostly his reptilian and mammalian brain. He doesn't have a lot of executive
Yeah.
functioning. And that's the same is true with our inner child. We also have the benefit of having our inner adult, but sometimes we allow that inner child, or our inner child is just really in a place where their needs aren't being met. And so we do these things that our inner adult is like, why did you just do that? That was actually harmful
Yeah.
to you. That wasn't an intuitive choice. But that's where it goes back to, we have to figure out which of the needs is not being met, and then step in as the inner adult and say, okay, I hear that you think that eating this sleeve of Oreos is going to help, but actually I think you need a break. I think that you just were slammed with this work project and with all of these, you've been meeting other people's needs all day, and we need to just like take a step back, and make sure that you are being taken care of rather than kind of escaping into this sugar.
Mm, I love that. Yeah. Do we have an inner teenager?
Oh, probably. Yes, the rebel. That's one of my favorite characters in the intuitive eating concept. I'm not sure how much you've talked about that on your podcast, but I think the different characters in intuitive eating are really helpful to understand. And the rebel can either be
Mm,
really helpful and be on your side against diet culture or against people telling you rules or whatever, or your inner rebel can accidentally be sabotaging you. But what the rebel always does is advocate for your needs. And they're just either doing it in a way that's using your executive functioning, or they're living in those lower levels of the brain and doing that more impulsive sort of advocating.
yeah, I'm wondering too, now that you mentioned that, if I'm sure you're very familiar with the small handful of people who have kind of turned intuitive eating into like this cult, like cult like activities. And I'm wondering if that's where they're stuck, like
Mm-hmm.
with the rebel. Um,
Yeah,
because that's also not healthy.
right.
And yeah, I remember like being way over here, like super deep into diet culture and um feeling morally superior because I ate better than everyone else when I was secretly binging, all the things. And
Mm-hmm.
then I learned intuitive eating. And then I went over here to this space for a while. And like, I had a lot of red flags that were like, I don't know. And then just kind of bringing myself back to the center and just doing what's best for me and helping my clients do what's best for them. But all that said, like, I'd love your take on this side. Not that there has
I
to be
totally
sides,
agree.
but I mean there is that handful of people that the uneducated intuitive eating people will listen to because that's what they think it is, and it's just not.
Yeah, it's an interesting space. It's an interesting intersection that I personally feel like I'm living in, both from being trained as an intuitive eating counselor, but also being from a diabetes education background and understanding physiologically what happens in the body at like with different things. And
Mhm.
adipose tissue actually does produce hormones. Like it is like an actual organ in our body. And so, um, you know, anyway, we can go into like the physiology of that, but it's been an interesting place to try to navigate. I want everybody to have full freedom of food and understand that weight is only one of the many, 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 many factors in health. And I think we give it way too much importance when we talk about it either
Yeah,
culturally or even medically. But on the other hand, it has a place in medicine. And so like where do you find that balance? And I think what you're speaking to is honestly, I think that these are people who have not completed their intuitive eating journey yet. Not that we're ever totally complete, but
right.
you were even when you were discussing this, you're sort of using the hand motions of what I call the pendulum swing. We
Yeah,
start on one end and then we swing to the other, and that's a normal response. Anytime and this goes back to that restriction. The more restriction you have, the more likely you are to swing very widely to a binge episode. So when I use that analogy a lot because the goal of progress is not for you to find center tomorrow. That doesn't happen with a pendulum. But what a pendulum does is each time it swings a little bit less and a little bit less and a little bit less until eventually it's in this like
yeah.
really tight, really easy center. It's not difficult, it's just normal. And so I guess the first thing I want to do is normalize the journey that if you've come, the more restrictive you've been, probably the wider your swing will be. But I don't want you to stay there. I want you to help you swing back. And some of it is, a lot of it is around getting curious. But how do I really feel if I'm going to move away from food and use an example of movement. How would I feel if I only sat on the couch all of the time? I only sat at my desk at my computer and never moved my body at all. Eventually, my joints would be complaining and my back would be hurting and all these other things. So that would be like the extreme version of anti-exercise is just sitting or laying all day. And even thinking about that, you and I are like, oh my gosh, this makes me want to get up and move because we know
Right.
how bad
Did
that
you
could
see me
feel.
wiggle?
Yes. Yeah. So it's sort of the same thing with food. If we are like going very, to that opposite end, we're never going to feel good if we're only eating donuts and candy and whatever you want to like think of. That's also one of the reasons why I created the Peas and Coffee Meal Guides app, is because I wanted to show people how you can do both things. You actually can
Mm,
eat really delicious food in a way that honors your body. And when you're doing that, I think one thing that's really challenging in our culture is that it's it's just really difficult to get a really good balance of nutrition in our culture, because convenience is king. A lot of times less healthy nourishing foods are more expensive, or are less expensive, and so we've got all these other barriers to eating well and nourishing our body besides just this diet culture is a big thing, but also there's other real things about it. And so, as a dietitian, when I'm working with someone to learn how to nourish their body, sometimes we don't even know how badly we feel when eating all of this junk, or we don't, let me use a more positive way of framing that. We don't know how good we could feel if we were really nourishing our body the way it deserves to be nourished.
yeah, I love that.
That was a long
Um,
explanation.
and then
I'm not sure if
also,
that answered your question.
no, it did.
Hold.
And then there's also the piece of, so like for me, for example, and I can only ever use my own experience because other people have different experiences, but there were healthy foods or diet foods that I pretended to like.
Mm,
For example, kombucha.
mm,
I don't like it. But I pretended to. And like I don't even know any other examples, but there are also things that I do like that after starting to pay attention to my reaction to different foods. My example is quinoa. I love quinoa, but every time I eat it, I get a really bad stomach ache. So I don't
mm.
eat it anymore.
Bummer.
And it's so good for you. But I don't even remember, why did I bring that up? Oh, because you were talking about some people don't know how good they can feel when they stop eating the other stuff. And some people um can figure out like the healthy foods that also don't make them feel so great or they
Mm-hmm.
don't like. Um, so yeah. Uh,
Taste preferences and nutrition, I think, I mean, boy, we could talk for hours about taste preferences alone, because
yeah.
one of the phrases that I think about a lot in this is we like what we eat most often. So I don't know if
Mhm.
you knew this, but our taste buds only live for 2 weeks. So we are constantly updating our palate, constantly. We're constantly getting a new palate and kind of training it. And the most extreme example of this is that if you've ever like gone on a low sodium diet, like if I have a patient with heart failure, let's say, and they truly need a low sodium diet so they don't have water retention, we everything tastes super bland at first when you first go low sodium, because salt is a flavor enhancer. But after about a month, you go back, and if you've been on this low salt eating pattern, and then all of a sudden you go and you eat like McDonald's French fries, you're like, oh my gosh, I can barely even handle these because they're so salty. So our taste buds actually do adapt to what we are eating, and the more nutritious, nourishing food you eat, the more you are going to crave them, and the more sensitive you're going to be towards tasting other things. Like if you are, let's see, if you're a baker, if you love to bake your own baked goods, and you are, you have somebody like you're making homemade cupcakes and homemade muffins and all these really delicious things, and then you go and you eat a store-bought muffin, you are going to be like, oh my gosh, this does not taste good, because I can like taste all of this little nuance in the different preservatives they have to add, and the stabilizers. And so in the same way, you actually can train yourself to like a healthier diet, but you have to like start eating it. And it's really
Right.
interesting how that'll change. Or the opposite will be true. If you are sort of like stuck in this ultra processed food, then you're going to be craving more ultra processed food, because that's what your palate is used to. You're not used to all of the, typically ultra processed food has fewer flavor notes. Like they're not using a lot of different spices. And so if you are used to ultra processed foods and McDonald's hamburgers, and then you go to like a homemade Indian restaurant, there's going to be like way too many flavors. Your palate is going to be like, what is happening? I don't even know
Yeah.
how to handle this. But the more you expose yourself, the more you'll actually enjoy that flavor palette.
That's awesome. Isn't that where the saying you crave what you eat? Not you are what you eat, but you crave what you eat.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
you really do.
I want to take a hard right or left, whichever way you want to go. And I'm wondering if you're open to sharing your story of how you got into this work and if there's like a story of maybe feeling empowered or like an aha moment or something like that to share with the listeners.
Honestly, I became a dietitian because I love food. I grew up on a farm in Kansas, and I didn't, I was like in high school, like I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I was like, maybe I'll be a doctor. Like medicine was interesting, caring for people. And then when I was a senior in high school, we had to do a senior project, and I made a cookbook. That was my senior project. I made and sold a cookbook. And my advisor was like, "Oh, you should be a dietitian." And I was like, "Hang on, there's a profession about food. I'm absolutely doing that." So it's kind of honestly like my journey through this. I describe it as like pulling the thread. I've just sort of like pulled the thread of what's been interesting to me, and I've ended up here. So I first started pulling the thread in college. I studied abroad in Spain and learned to speak Spanish. And I came back and I was like, okay, how can I help people who speak Spanish in the realm of nutrition? And that's how I got into diabetes, was because people, typically Spanish speaking people, have a higher rates of diabetes in the US. And so I was like,
Okay.
this could be an area where I could use this language and use food. And that's how I just kind of like pulled the thread and got into diabetes. And it turned out I loved it so much. I loved working with my patients with diabetes because, well, ironically, because it was really hard. Like chronic disease is one of the hardest realms to be in because it never ever goes away. And you
Yeah.
have to you go through a grief cycle. And but one of the beautiful things about working with people in a chronic disease is that you develop relationships with them. It's not like you get sick and you get an antibiotic and you get well. This is like we're seeing you every 3 months indefinitely. And so I really got to know my patients. And in getting to know them, it was a very humbling experience because I started to realize that it wasn't the calories in, calories out that is the traditional model that I was even taught in college and in my traditional training. It was a lot more. It was about culture and affordability and access issues and socioeconomic, the social determinants of health. It was about, did you experience trauma as a child? Did you experience food insecurity as a child? And so it was such a humbling experience, and really helped me give more grace to people and understand that this is why part of my story today, or what I'm talking about, it's all going back to the why. Because if you're not answering the question of why, you're never really solving the problem. So anyway, pulled the thread, working with diabetes, chronic disease. And then I sort of got to this place where my ultimate passion, my ultimate goal, I'm not quite where I want to be on my journey. I would really like to work ultimately in food systems and start to talk about, again, like not just why diet culture is a piece of the why our health is so poor in America, but even taking a step back behind that and asking ourselves, why aren't we growing the food that would nourish our bodies? Why are we growing so much corn and soy and commodity grains that are ultimately leading us down this path of cheap, ultra processed foods that don't have the nutrients that we need to feed us? So, how did
Mm.
I get here and why am I here? I actually feel like I'm not totally at the end of my journey, but in the middle of it here, I am trying to bridge this gap of agriculture, food, and loving what you eat and nutrition. And that's why I am creating recipes and meal plans for people to try and meet them in that intersection of all of these different things. That was a long answer to your question.
Oh, I love it. And I love that you say you're not there yet because I don't think we ever get to the destination that we intended to go to, if that makes sense. Because
Mm-hmm.
in the I like the word adventure over journey. I don't know why, but in the adventure, we're changing as people, and we're learning new things, and we're going, oh, maybe this sounds good instead. And so like while we do have an end goal, the goal is constantly changing because we're changing, right?
Yes.
And so I love that you mentioned, "No, I'm not there yet because I want to do this." And I love everything that I love it all. So
Yeah, it's
thanks for
so
being an
fun.
awesome human.
Oh, I mean, thank you for giving me a voice. I mean, to share my story. It's I just want people to know that there's just so much more behind the scenes than I think we give ourselves credit for sometimes. And especially in a world that's constantly telling us to fix things or to fix ourselves, I think we are just so focused all the time on surface level issues that we don't really allow ourselves to heal. So I just want people to know that it's okay to not feel okay. It's okay if it feels hard. It feels hard because it is hard and you're in the right spot.
Yeah. And all the obstacles that you think you're supposed to get over or you think are there to stop you on your journey, it's actually part of the journey. Like,
Absolutely. Yes.
just go right through it. So, adventure. I meant to say adventure.
I love that. Yeah, I love that word adventure. That brings such a like fun light to that. Journey yeah,
Yeah, it makes me
I
feel like a
hear
kid.
love it.
I do have one more question for you, and you might have just answered it, but I'm going to ask anyway. If you had one piece of advice that you could give to the world, what would it be?
Just one.
Or
Um,
two.
I think it would be to approach with curiosity and not judgment. And I say that because I think it brings in this piece of grace that we were just talking about. So when you're struggling with something, if you can remove the judgment from it and just wonder what's going on, that'll help you get to the why and help you really to get to some real answers, not just surface level ones, not just ones that you feel like are kind of fixing the problem, but are really solving the underlying issue.
Boom. Beautiful beasts, and Kent signing off. Until next time. Balaka.